Good morning, everybody. How'd that paper treat you last night? Liked it? Enjoyed every minute of it? Will make your brain better, I promise. But I'll tell you what, man, it's got to feel good going into Friday afternoon knowing that you're done, at least for this class. Right? So anyway, do you have any questions before I go ahead and get us going? Any questions that we can address? All right, let me talk just, yeah, question.
I just didn't understand what you were talking about, the enlightenment of the Great Awakening. I didn't get that.
All right, let me talk about that in just a moment, okay? We'll talk about that in just a second. First of all, paper one is due today, right? That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but turn it in up front before you leave. Secondly, everybody, in addition to turning in a hard copy, I need you to upload a digital copy online in the week 5 assignment folder, okay? I know that there was a mistake on the guidelines that was telling you to go to week 12. It's actually inside week 5. So if you go to week 12, you're going to only see paper 2. Obviously, you want paper 1. So click week 5, and then open up the assignment folder, and you can't miss it. Now, I need you to upload paper 1 as soon as you can. Now, if it doesn't get done in the next 3 hours, you've got to go to work, you've got to pick up your kid, whatever, right? It's not the end of the world, but sooner is much, much better than later. Because here's what's going to happen this time next week when I return your papers. If I don't have your paper uploaded to eCampus, I don't give you back your paper, okay? Now, I'm not failing the paper. What I'm saying is I don't upload your score and I don't hand it back to you until I see that you've gone through the trouble of uploading it to eCampus. Now, the reason this is so important is I've had people that have just drug their feet week after week after week after week, and December rolls around and it's still not uploaded. So as far as I'm concerned, it was never turned in, right? And I very well may have the record of me grading it, but because we've gone through it a solid 10 weeks of you not uploading it, you know, I don't think anything of just saying, oh, well, so-and-so never turned it in. So the bottom line is, it doesn't have to be done like right this instant, but I really wouldn't push it past Sunday. Yeah.
So you're saying we either upload it through the internet or turn it in?
Both. I'm saying, in addition to handing this in, I need you to go into week 5's assignment folder, upload it. You're done. All right. Just do it soon. So does anybody have a question about that? All right. The enlightenment. Is there any other thing that you had asked?
Great Awakening. I thought
Oh, what? Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Real quick question.
Would we be trying to do it online today?
No. It's not a points thing. I just need it to be there until I return, or I won't return it again. Until I see it. Okay? All right, so who can help us out? The Enlightenment. Good question. What was the Enlightenment? Yeah.
Rebirth of thinking.
Rebirth of thinking. And in particular, as it relates to American political thought, the thinker that we need to be most concerned about would be John Locke. Why? Why John Locke? Government is of the people. Government exists, it has power, because the people consent for it to have power. Without the consent of the people, government has no power. Okay? Are there any questions to that end? Does that help you answer the question? You can wrap your mind around that, you'll be fine. Now, pietism. What is pietism? That's deism, right? The idea that there's a power higher than mankind. I'm not exactly sure what that is. Pietism is very much a Christian philosophy. But what does it emphasize? What? Yeah, go ahead.
That you can have your own personal relationship with God.
There you go. That you don't have to be pope, you don't have to be priest, you don't have to be the king of England, you don't have to be a blue-blooded aristocrat to have an impression of what the Bible really means, let alone having a relationship with your Creator. So, for your notes, what pietism really is a democratic version of religion. Right? There's a democratic flair to American religiosity, and you don't have to be a historian or a political scientist to see how this is going to influence thinking at the time. Right? If you don't have to be born into wealth or power to have a thought on religion, you also don't have to be born into wealth or power to have a thought on government or political societies. It's emphasizing that in the eyes of our Creator, Ann Hutchinson, all men are created equal, right? So again, it's being dumped into this melting pot that is emphasizing American political thought is growing during this time. So does that answer your question? So we're good on that. Now, my question for you as far as the review goes, what is happening in 1763? What's happening that really strains the relationship between Britain and its colonies? Yeah.
All these acts are passed along.
Okay, Britain is passing new laws. And who can name me one of the earlier laws that it's passing that's really upsetting the American colonies? Maybe that somebody's been a little quiet today. All right, Stamp Act comes in 1765. That's important. But what comes before the Stamp Act? Yeah. Yeah. Molasses Act comes all the way back in 1733, but it's the Sugar Act that's really problematic when it comes to straining this relationship. What does the Sugar Act do? And think about this in the context of the Molasses Act. What does it do? It puts a tax on sugar, right? Now, the reason that this is a big deal is because in 1764, the Prime Minister, George Grenville, says, this time we really mean it. This time we're actually going to collect that tax. And we're going to begin cracking down on smugglers, right? How do they crack down on smugglers? Like John Hancock, what do they do? Right, they issued writs of assistance, they raided ships, and lo and behold, they discovered illegal sugar, they discovered contraband, right? And they discovered that John Hancock was actually not paying his taxes. So people like John Hancock are all hot and bothered by this. And really what they're doing is they're encouraging these young, jobless, frustrated colonists that call themselves the Sons of Liberty, right? Little more than a street gang if you really want to boil it down, but they're encouraging the Sons of Liberty to go out there and protest, go out there and intimidate, go out there and vent their frustrations, right? Now, the Stamp Act, what does that tax? Anything that's got writing on it, anything with print on it, anything from a marriage license to a deck of playing cards is going to be taxed. So there's very, very little way that you can avoid paying the Stamp Act, right? Now, again, it's people like John Hancock and people like James Otis that are encouraging the Sons of Liberty to go out there and exercise their right to protest. And how are they making it very clear to the English government that they will not be taxed without representation? No taxation without representation? What are they doing to stamp collectors? Well, they're hanging their effigies, right? You remember what an effigy is? It's a scarecrow, it's a dummy that's dressed up to represent someone or something else. So it was very typical to dress up stamp collectors or maybe a British politician to get your point across. Now let me ask you, even if you're this big, beefy, tough-looking guy, and you see a gang of street toughs that are hanging this effigy and chanting no taxation without representation, are you going to run over to them and say, hey, you know what? You owe us back taxes. Are you going to do something like that? Yeah, me neither, right? And for good reason. Because what the Sons of Liberty were good at doing was intimidating, holding these quote-unquote rallies, which would be very borderline to riots, okay? But they're a very powerful mechanism when it comes to the resisting of these new laws. And that's what I want to talk about today, how the American colonists resisted these new laws. Now, the way that the quote-unquote rabble resisted was by rioting and intimidation. There's another form of resistance as well, though. That's what I want to focus on today. Last time we met, we were talking about the Stamp Act Congress. Who remembers what the Stamp Act Congress was and what they were doing?
Reaction to the Stamp Act.
It was a reaction to the Stamp Act. But who are they and what are they doing? Good. There's representatives from many of the colonies, and they're talking to Great Britain. They're talking to the government over there in London. And what are they saying about the Stamp Act? Bad idea, man. It's a bad idea, and you need to repeal reveal it. Okay? So Britain is being hit by a two-front war here. On the one hand, they've got the Sons of Liberty, and on the other hand, there's a Stamp Act Congress, and in addition to advising them that this is a bad idea, they have implemented an American boycott of British goods. Now let's slow down and think about this for just a moment. We remember that American colonists were the #1 customer of the British manufacturing sector. We did more business with them than anybody else in the British colonies, okay? Now, if we go ahead and we say, we're going to stop buying your stuff, that's going to make a major impact on people's decisions to pass laws or to not pass laws. Many of these British members of Parliament, they have financial interests in America. Some of them are actually manufacturers, and when we've said we're no longer going to buy your stuff because we don't appreciate the way that you're treating us, that message was received loud and clear. I mean, if you really want to get your point across, if you really want to take it to somebody and make it hurt, don't punch him in the face. Punch him in the pocketbook. Hit him in the wallet. Works every time, right? And in this case, it worked too, right? What we're doing, guys, this is the way that I've always liked to think about it. What we're doing is we're acting like a toddler in Target. We're kicking, we're screaming, we're swearing, we're spitting, right? We're throwing our little fit, and ultimately, we're going to get our way. In 1766, it was the British that blinked, and they're going to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, leading into 1766, we have these people like James Otis. He was the guy that we were talking about the last time we met. And what James Otis is talking about in the context of the Stamp and Sugar Act, he's talking about natural rights. Natural rights. First of all, what is a right? You hear these people, some of you have kids, right? They say, you don't have the right to ground me, or you don't have the right to send me out of a room, or things like that. That's a gross exaggeration of what a right actually is. What is a right? You are entitled to it because it is given by our Creator, however you want to think about that. Judeo-Christian enlightenment, I don't care, but it's something that you're born with, hence the term natural rights. And people like James Otis are saying during this time period, you have a natural right to your life. You have a natural right to your property. It can't be denied to you simply because the British government doesn't want you to have it. Now, when they say property, they mean their taxes. And because the British are not giving us any kind of representation in Parliament, they're violating our natural rights. So you've got life, you've got property, liberty, another natural right. But more importantly than anything else, what James Otis was really concerned about was our right to privacy, right? Remember, it's James Otis that was a really big advocate of a man's home being his castle. And every card-carrying citizen of the British Empire deserved to have this right of privacy. And the British officials going on board these boats and seizing this contraband, and worse yet, sending the offenders into the middle of the Atlantic Ocean so that they can be tried on these vice admiralty courts, what they were doing by invading our privacy was invading our natural rights. Now, what is going to be the ultimate articulation of the right to privacy? In other words, where are you going to find it in, I don't know, an American founding document? So, there you go, the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which says that if I'm paraphrasing obviously, that if a police officer pulls you over, right, they don't just automatically have the right to sift through your belongings, right? They need a warrant or probable cause. If they think that you're guilty of a crime, at that point, that's when they can look you over, right? But we can understand, I want you to write this down, that natural rights, including our right to privacy, becomes a really big cornerstone in the idea of American political thought. There's that phrase again, American political thought. James Otis, natural rights, a natural right to privacy, right? That's a cornerstone of American political thought. Just like the Enlightenment. The idea that government derives its power from the people, that's another cornerstone. Natural rights, including privacy. Cornerstone of American political thought. Should we be able to take that from us? Because no one has the ability to take it from us because it's God-given. Make sense? Do you have any questions? All right, moving right along. What happens in 1766 is two things. One, George Grenville, the guy that was brought to London to get them out of debt, he's removed as Prime Minister. It cost him his job when he repealed the Stamp Act. So this fit that we're throwing, it's actually having consequences in Great Britain. But at the same time, what you're going to see happen is the shift in focus. The main objective of the Sugar Act and Stamp Act was to generate money. And now that focus is going to shift to who is in charge. Who is in charge? Is it the Americans that's in charge when it comes to making laws in the colonies, or is it going to be Great Britain? Well, in 1766, to make sure everybody was on the same page, what the British Parliament does is it issues the Declaratory Act. Now, the Declaratory Act doesn't tax anybody. It doesn't throw anybody in jail, right? All it says, and I want you to write it down, is that British law is supreme. British law is the law of the land. That if they really wanted to, they could make the Stamp Act stick, right? What they're trying to say here is, we have every right to tax our colonies. We're going to repeal this because we feel that it's in our best interest to repeal it. But make no mistake about it, if we wanted to make it stick, we absolutely have every right under the sun to do that. Does that make sense? That's the Declaratory Act. Now, when Grenville goes away, they need to replace him with somebody. And the somebody that they replace him with is this guy right here, Charles Townshend. Okay? Now, what you should know about Charles Townshend is that his job is actually going to be tougher than Grenville. He still needs to find additional ways to generate revenue. In other words, taxing the American colonies. But he's also got to convince the American colonists that it's the British lawmakers that are in charge. That they can have an opinion on this, and if there's something that the British law is not saying, then of course that's when your Virginia legislature can come in and make a law. But you need to understand, we're the adults in the room, we are in charge, and your laws are subservient, secondary to ours. Okay? So that's Charles Townshend. And there's one more thing that I'd like you to understand and associate with this guy. What he assumes the problem is in America is a financial problem. In other words, it's about dollars and cents. We don't want to pay more for our goods and our services, and of course the Stamp Act is raising the cost of living. So he assumes that if you can spread this risk of paying more for your stuff out to other things, it's going to do the two things that he needs to do. It's going to force the American colonists to pay the tax, right? But it's also going to force them to acknowledge that British law is supreme. What do I mean? What I'm talking about here, guys, are the Townshend Acts, a series of new laws that are going to place duties, taxes, that is, on consumer items. That's what you need to write down. A series of new laws on consumer items. I'm talking about things like paper. You paid a tax when you bought paper. Tea. You paid a tax when you bought tea. Glass had a tax on it as it related to the Townshend Acts. All right? Now, this tax was relatively low in the grand scheme of things. It's a lot like sales tax. I mean, even a state like Texas, where we pay 8% sales tax, that's not going to break the bank when it comes to going over to Subway, is it? Right? I mean, it might be a little bit annoying. It does raise the cost of living a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, it's rarely felt. Okay? Now, that's what Townshend and the British officials assumed was the problem. But the problem wasn't dollars and cents as far as people like John Adams, James Otis was concerned. It's about the principle. The principle is, if you're going to tax us, we ought to be having representation over there in Parliament, and we clearly don't. So that's the big problem, and there's this disconnect between Britain and the colonies to that end. Now, in addition to the Townshend Acts, Townshend also issues something called the Restraining Act. And what the Restraining Act does is exactly what it sounds like it does. It tells those American lawmaking bodies in New England, in Virginia, in Maryland, you come secondary to British law. In other words, it's restraining their ability to pass these laws that say one thing or another about how life works in the American colonies. What they're saying is, British law is going to remain supreme. We need you to recognize, and more importantly, we need you to actually acknowledge that our laws are the supreme law of the land. Whatever we don't say, oh, I don't know, everybody has to wear plaid shorts on Friday. If we don't say that, then if you want to make it a law, then knock yourself out, you can make that a law. All right? Now, how do we feel about the Townshend Acts? Is this something that's going to go over all that well in American life? Of course not. And as far as most American colonists were concerned, this Townshend guy, he's just the second coming of Grenville. He didn't learn a darn thing about what Grenville had gotten himself in trouble over. Right? He didn't learn that what it was about was the principle of Laconian democracy, representation in government. Okay? So once again, for the second time in almost 3 years, we're kicking, we're screaming, we're whining, we're complaining, we're swearing, we're calling the Parliament every curse word under the sun, and we're going to implement yet a second boycott. Right? Yeah.
With the Prime Minister? Is that his name?
Townshend was the Prime Minister, yeah. So we're throwing in other things. And we're doing so by, again, refusing to buy their stuff. All right? Here's the problem, though. This boycott is a lot like a work stoppage, a strike, right? I mean, when you strike, you're not making any money. It's one of the primary reasons that you see so few strikes, labor stoppages, in this day and age. That in order to do this, you need to be able to afford not to get paid for a while. What's going to be the problem with implementing a strike or, in this case, a boycott? What's going to be the problem? Well, not enough money, or in this case, not enough textiles, not enough stuff that we need. How long can we hold out, right? I mean, it's going to get to a point where we're going to be starving for this stuff, and if it's not coming from Britain, it needs to come from somewhere else. My question for you, what is our options when it comes to finding it somewhere else? Where can we find it? We need to find it, but where?
Caribbean?
Yeah, but the problem is the British are really policing, what gets in and what gets out. Spain too, they're really policing that, right? You're overthinking it, right? Where it's going to come from is from within. You're going to see the development of an American textile industry from the Daughters of Liberty. We've got the Sons of Liberty, and now we're going to talk about the Daughters of Liberty. When one of these patriots, like Samuel Adams, would have a rally at his place or organize a rally, of course he'd bring all of his buddies, and they'd get good and stinking drunk while they complained about what the British politicians were doing to them. But all the wives, and all the sisters, and all the daughters, and all the female relatives were there too. And while the guys were getting drunk and complaining, what the ladies were doing is they were spinning cotton into thread. Thread into textiles, weaving it into textiles, and ultimately providing the textiles that we so dearly missed when we stopped buying the British textiles. So what's the Daughters of Liberty? What is their contribution to this boycott? What are they bringing to the table? Textiles, and they're giving us the wherewithal. They're giving us the opportunity for holding out longer, right? Because if you're a British member of Parliament and you're worried about these textile manufacturers who exercise a lot of authority, a lot of power in Great Britain, right? What you can tell them before the Daughters of Liberty is just wait long enough and eventually we'll starve them out. What the Daughters of Liberty are doing is exhausting that alternative. Now we don't really need your textiles, or at least not to the same volumes. Yeah.
So what is the text definition, Daughters of Liberty?
Daughters of Liberty is a lot like the Sons of Liberty. What they're doing is they're trying to vent their frustrations as it relates to these unjust laws, or what we consider to be unjust laws. And they're doing so not by intimidating stamp collectors, not by holding these, crazy rallies or anything. They're doing it by producing textiles, which is undercutting the British economy because we're their best customer. Now we can say, not only do we not want your stuff, we no longer need it, or at least not to the same volumes. Okay? Does that answer your question? Okay. Now, that's, from a legal perspective, I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure there were mercantilistic policies as it relates to, whether or not you can do something like this. But, boycotts are one of the more effective means of getting your point across in any time period, not just this colonial time period. In 1955, the way that local busing was integrated in Montgomery, Alabama, was a group of African-American women said, if you're going to treat us this way, we're just not going to take the bus. And the black community represented upwards of 60% of the bus company's clientele base. And when they stopped paying to ride the bus company's profit margin went into the toilet. So it's a very effective way of demonstrating something and getting people to do something that they otherwise wouldn't do. Anyway, any other questions before we move on? Let's talk about Boston, right? Because it's in Boston that a lot of this fiery, revolutionary, anti-British rhetoric is coming from, okay? Now, what I need you to understand about this Second American boycott, this Second American fit, meltdown, whatever, it worked once again. So we're 2 in a row now, right? 2 times in the last 3 years, we've thrown a fit, we've got our way. But this time, when the British repealed the Townshend Acts, they said, we're going to go ahead and get rid of this law, but we're also going to make an example of Boston. They sent British regular troops to occupy the city of Boston. Okay? That was Lord North's first order of business. Lord North replaces Charles Townshend as the Prime Minister. He says, I'll repeal it, but I'm also going to teach you a lesson. And he sent British troops to occupy the city. Now, we know that this was not a popular move, considering there was always this long-standing tension between British subjects and British troops. If the king wasn't at war, and in 1767 he's not, you shouldn't be seeing a whole lot of troops. And here they are. And they're also doing things like driving up the cost of rent because they're competing for apartments. They're dragging down the price of wages because they're competing for jobs. So there's a lot of tension, for obvious reasons, between the British troops and Bostonians. So what do you assume would happen at the taverns at night, at the streets in the middle of the day? What would happen between the Sons of Liberty and the British regulars? Fights, right? Arguments, everyday riots in certain instances, everyday occurrences. This is something that's happening all the time. And one of the ways that we see it manifest itself is in March of 1770 with the Boston Massacre. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about.
In 1768, after Bostonians had demonstrated they would not remain passive, the British sent troops to occupy the city.
Both sides created tension in the years between 1768 and 1770 when the Boston Massacre took place. The British came in, many of the soldiers who weren't paid enough tried to get jobs in town, which hurt Americans who were trying to get those same jobs. They drove up the cost of housing, they drove up the cost of food. Americans, on the other hand, did not exactly receive these troops with open arms. They had always been suspicious of standing armies in time of peace. That was one thing that was not allowed in England, and yet here it was happening in America. Tensions arose, barroom brawls, taunting, just general unease. Nobody was happy with those troops.
You damned rascally scoundrel! Watch the son of a
On the night of March 5th, 1770, a roving band of young Bostonians came upon a lone red-coated sentry. The mob started taunting the British soldier, hurling objects, snowballs, and insults.
Kill him! Kill him! Knock him down!
The sentry called for help, and the situation quickly escalated.
Damn your blood! I'll make a lane through you all!
Fire! 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 Damn you! Damn you! You can't kill us all!
The soldiers tried to use their bayonets to establish some breathing room as the crowd continued to push forward.
My lads, they will not fire!
It is true that the soldiers had been severely provoked when the so-called massacre occurred, but nevertheless, when all was said and done, 5 Americans were dead, and they were killed at the hands of British soldiers. And the propaganda value of that incident was tremendous, in the hands particularly of people like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Samuel Adams went to him and asked him to make an etching of the Boston Massacre, which you'll have in practically every U.S. history book today. And Revere said that he wasn't there, and Adams said, well, I wasn't there either, but I'll tell you what it looked like.
It was a great source of propaganda. Paul Revere created a really graphic poster, broadside as they called them at the time, showing coffins and showing a highly exaggerated image of what supposedly had gone on in King Street in Boston. What he printed was nothing like what really did happen. But it was a great way of spreading the word elsewhere that the British meant business and the colonists were in danger.
You've got the huge, huge soldiers, and you've got the colonists kind of all going back like this, like they're being attacked without any provocation at all. And you've got a little dog that's playing in the background. So, I mean, it looks as though you've got innocent liberty being attacked by ferocious, tyrannical power. And that's exactly the picture that Samuel Adams wanted people to get.
I want to ask you something. I'm going to pick up on what the video talked about. I'm really not going to touch upon some of the things that it did, but let me ask you this question. How do you know what George Washington looked like? How do you know? Or Henry VIII, or Napoleon Bonaparte? Paintings, not photographs, paintings. Now, who's doing the paintings of people like Henry VIII?
Artists.
Artists that are being paid by Henry VIII. In other words, they need to provide a pleasing product for their customers. And what is Henry VIII kind of known for? Is he known for the guy that's going to treat you with kid's gloves if he doesn't like you very much? Right? He's the guy that's chopping off his wives' heads. Right? So what's he going to do to you if you make him look stupid in one of these paintings? Right? Exactly. So, right. So what you've got here is not a photograph. It's somebody's impression of what happened. And that somebody just so happens to be Paul Revere, a guy that really didn't like the British soldiers all that much either, right? And what he tells the guy that's paying him to do this, Samuel Adams, is, hey, I wasn't there, so I don't know what it looks like. Did Sam Adams attend? What he said? But let me tell you how things went down. In other words, this is what I want you to do. Now, do you remember what Paul Revere did for a living? He's a silversmith. And back during this time period, when the presses are really starting to come into their own, it's becoming a new technology. If you wanted one of these broadsides, you had to go to a silversmith to make an etching. You needed a skilled craftsman to do this. Here's, again, a plug for our Boston excursion. Right? Not only can you go stand in Paul Revere's house, which, by the way, is one of the oldest homes, oldest buildings for that matter, anywhere in Boston, right? You can actually see some of these old original broadsides that he was etching, including the one that we've got behind me. And he considered this very famous image in American history now to be scrap paper in the aftermath of the Revolution. He flipped it over and had another broadside right on the back, right? So what this ultimately amounts to is propaganda. Who are the aggressors? The British, right? And who are the innocent bystanders that are being attacked? The colonists, right? The British have guns. Not only do the colonists not, who's being killed here? This guy's laying on the ground. Looks like this guy might have taken a bullet. You can clearly see the smoke going off, and the British are clearly aiming their firearms right at the American colonists. So this is a very powerful piece of propaganda. It's designed to invoke emotion, evoke anger. Yeah.
I heard that Benjamin Franklin also was a lawyer that defended some of the soldiers from the court.
Yeah, but I want to emphasize John Adams here. But yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. What we do with these soldiers in the aftermath of what becomes known as the Boston Massacre is we arrest them, right? We arrest them, and eventually we're going to put them on trial. Now, I want to ask you another maybe controversial question. Does everybody deserve a trial? That guy, yeah? That guy in Colorado that shot up that movie theater because he thought he was the Joker. There's very little evidence that would suggest he's not guilty. In other words, there's a lot of people that believe he's 99.9